They tell you the hardest part of being a fire lookout is the isolation. They say the silence eventually starts talking back to you, playing tricks on your mind until you can't tell the difference between a rustling leaf and a footstep. But they're lying. The silence is fine. It's actually a gift. It's when the silence is suddenly broken by something that shouldn't exist, a sound that defies every law of nature you've ever learned, and your boss tells you to simply ignore it. That's when the real nightmare starts. You see, in the Pacific Northwest, the trees aren't just wooden needles. They are ancient, towering witnesses to things we were never meant to see. I used to think the shadows moving between the trunks were just a trick of the evening light, or perhaps a bear looking for a late-night snack. But bears don't stand 6 feet tall and mimic the voice of your dead relatives. My name is Abby, and I've realized far too late that I'm not just watching for smoke plumes in this forest. I'm stationed at a gate, and whatever has been locked on the other side for centuries. It's finally starting to push through the wood, and it's using my radio to call my name. 4 months ago, I was a junior analyst in Seattle, suffocating in a gray cubicle under buzzing fluorescent lights. I wanted out. I wanted a job where the only urgent matter was a lightning strike or a stray hiker lost on the trail. When I got the call for the Black Elk National Forest post, I thought I'd finally escape the soul-crushing toxicity of corporate America. I thought my supervisor, Ranger Walker, would be a typical man of the woods, tough, fair, and a man of few words. I was half right. He has rules. But none of them are printed in the official Forest Service handbook. Walker didn't care about my resume, my background, or my degrees. He only cared about one thing. Could I keep my mouth shut when the world outside my window stopped making sense? He looked at me with those cold, glassy eyes and whispered, "The forest has a rhythm, Abby. It's a hungry, ancient beat. Don't you ever try to change the tune, or it might decide you're part of the feast." My third night, while the wind was howling like a wounded animal against the glass, I found it. A leather-bound ledger hidden deep under a loose floorboard beneath my cot. It wasn't left by the Forest Service. It was left by the person who had this job before me, someone who clearly didn't leave this tower through the front door. The handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding into the paper as if the person's hands were shaking uncontrollably. The warnings were specific. Rule number 1, never answer the radio after midnight, no matter who you think you hear. Rule number 2, if the trees start whistling a tune you recognize from your childhood, turn the volume of your static up until your ears bleed. On my third night, while the wind was howling like a wounded animal against the glass, I found it. I was reaching for a fallen pen when I noticed a loose floorboard right beneath my cot. Tucked deep inside was a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't an official Forest Service log. It belonged to the person who had this job before me, someone who clearly didn't leave this tower through the front door. The handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding into the paper as if their hands were shaking so hard they could barely hold the pen. The warnings were specific, almost desperate. Rule number 1, never, ever answer the radio after midnight, no matter how much the voice sounds like someone you love. Rule number 2, if the trees start whistling a tune you recognize from your childhood, turn the volume of your static up until your ears bleed. Just don't let that melody in. And then I heard it. Not the radio, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots hitting the iron stairs outside. Someone was climbing up. My supervisor, Ranger Walker, was coming for what he called an unscheduled performance review. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the trapdoor, the metallic jingle of his master key sliding into the lock. He didn't even knock. He just stood there in the dark, waiting for me to realize that the door was no longer a barrier. I'm recording this on an old SD card because I'm certain Walker isn't just a bad boss. He's a gatekeeper for something much worse. If you're hearing this, it means the forest got what it wanted. This is the truth about what happens in the deep woods when the sun goes down and the rules change forever. The morning after I found the hidden ledger, the sun didn't so much rise as it did bleed through the mist, staining the forest floor in shades of bruised purple and sickly orange. Walker appeared at the top of my tower before I'd even had a chance to wash the cold sweat from my face. He didn't knock. He never knocks. He just stood there, framed by the doorway, his tall, gaunt frame blocking the only exit. He didn't ask how I slept or if the storm had rattled the windows. Instead, his eyes went straight to the floorboard I had loosely replaced, tracking every microscopic movement of my hands as I clutched my coffee mug. "You look tired, Abby," he said. His voice wasn't kind. It was like gravel grinding together in a deep well. The forest demands a certain mental fortitude. Some people are built for the quiet, and some people are broken by it. Which one are you? That was the first time I felt the spark of defiance. I didn't look away. I asked him, straight out, about the missing person posters I'd seen plastered all over the ranger station in town. Faces of hikers, young and old, who seemed to simply dissolve into the shadows of Black Elk Park. I asked him why my GPS was showing coordinates that shifted every hour, and why the emergency frequency was filled with nothing but the sound of rhythmic clicking. His reaction wasn't anger. It was a slow, pitying smile that made my skin crawl. He told me that my job wasn't to map the woods or play detective, but to monitor the perimeter. He spoke about the forest as if it were a living, breathing patient in a hospital, and I was just a nurse who wasn't supposed to read the chart. Then he handed me a handwritten slip of paper. He wanted me to hike out to Sector 4, a place the locals call the Whispering Basin, to retrieve a series of heavy black canisters he'd left near an old, unmarked mine shaft. When I asked what was inside them, he leaned in so close I could smell the stale tobacco and something else, something metallic and sharp, like old blood. "Oxygen for the things that can't breathe our air," he whispered. "Don't open them, Abby, unless you want to find out why the birds don't fly over that sector. Do your job, and maybe you'll make it to the end of the month." I tried to be the employee he wanted. I really did. I put on my gear, strapped on my radio, and began the long trek into the heart of the Whispering Basin. But the deeper I went, the more the world felt like it was tilting on a broken axis. The birds had stopped singing miles back. Even the insects were silent. The air grew thick and heavy, tasting of ozone and wet copper. And the silence, it wasn't empty. It felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, pulsating with a low-frequency hum that made my vision blur at the edges. When I finally reached the coordinates, I didn't just find a mine shaft. I found a graveyard of lost intentions. Scattered across the mouth of the dark, yawning tunnel were piles of discarded ranger gear. Torn jackets with the Forest Service patch, cracked radios, and a rusted name tag that matched the frantic signature in the hidden ledger I'd found under my cot. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the pulsing in the air. Walker hadn't sent me on a retrieval mission. He was testing my obedience. He wanted to see if I would follow his insane orders even when standing knee-deep in the evidence of his crimes. I found the canisters, 6 of them, matte black and freezing to the touch, despite the afternoon heat. Against every instinct of self-preservation, against every warning written in that ledger, I reached out and shook one. It didn't sound like pressurized gas. It sounded like a thick, viscous liquid sloshing around. And then something tapped back. 3 distinct rhythmic knocks from the inside of the reinforced steel. My blood turned to ice. At that exact moment, my radio chirped, the static sounding like a scream. It was Walker. He didn't ask for my status or my location. He didn't ask if I was safe. He just whispered one sentence that shattered my soul. "I told you not to touch the cargo, Abby. Now you've made it curious, and it really wants to meet the person who disturbed its sleep." I don't remember the hike back. I just remember running until my lungs burned and the trees became nothing but green streaks in the twilight. When I finally stumbled back into my tower, gasping for air and shaking so hard I could barely stand, Walker was already there. He was sitting in my chair, leaning back with his boots on my desk, casually drinking from my favorite mug. I started screaming. I yelled about the mine shaft, the torn uniforms, the terrifying, intelligent tapping, coming from inside those black canisters. I told him I was calling the state police, that I was done playing his sick games. But Walker didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just sat there, calm and still as a frozen lake, looking at me with a look of profound, mocking disappointment. "Abby, settle down," he said quietly, his voice dangerously smooth. "There are no canisters in Sector 4. There hasn't been an active mine shaft in this park since the 1920s. You've been up in this tower too long. The altitude, the isolation, it starts to play tricks on a woman's mind. You're seeing ghosts because you're looking for them." He stood up and turned his tablet toward me. The GPS logs showed that I had spent the entire afternoon sitting in a small sunny clearing just half a mile from the tower, doing absolutely nothing. The map showed no trail to the basin, no mine, nothing. But I could still feel the phantom cold of that metal canister on my palms. I could still hear the tapping in my dreams. He was gaslighting me, trying to erase my reality so he could keep his secrets buried in the dirt. As he walked toward the trap door, he paused and looked back at me, his face half hidden in the shadows. I've scheduled a mandatory psychological evaluation for you tomorrow morning, Abby. Until then, stay in the tower. Don't go outside. The things you're imagining out there, they might start imagining you back, and I can't guarantee they'll be as patient as I am. That was the moment I realized I wasn't an employee anymore. I was a prisoner in a glass cage, and my only hope was to find the truth before the evaluation became my official disappearance. The night felt like it was made of lead, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the tower windows until I thought the glass might simply shatter from the pressure of the dark. After Walker left, I didn't just lock the trapdoor. I pushed my heavy equipment trunk over it, stacking my books and water crates on top, though I knew deep down that a wooden floor and a rusted bolt wouldn't stop whatever he had become. Every creak of the tower's timber felt like a footstep. I sat in the absolute dark, the only light coming from the pale, sickly glow of the radio dial, which seemed to pulse like a dying heart. I knew I couldn't wait for morning. The psych evaluation wasn't going to be a doctor with a clipboard or a sympathetic ear. It was going to be Walker and whatever those black canisters were meant to feed, arriving under the cover of a staged medical emergency. I grabbed my pack with trembling hands, stuffing the hidden ledger inside along with a flare gun, the only thing I had that felt even remotely like a weapon. My plan was simple and suicidal. I wasn't going to run to the park exit. Walker would be watching the main roads, his truck parked like a predator in the shadows of the gate. Instead, I was going back to his office at the base of the mountain. If the truth existed, if there was any proof of what was happening, it was in the files he kept under lock and key in that smoke-stained room. As I climbed down the exterior ladder, the cold metal biting into my palms, the wind didn't just blow, it whispered. It sounded like 1,000 jagged voices humming that same distorted tune from the ledger, catching in the needles of the pines. Every time I looked into the tree line, the shadows seemed to stretch and snap back, like elastic being pulled to its breaking point. I reached the forest floor and began to move, staying off the main trails where the mud would betray my footprints. I passed a creek where the water ran black as oil, reflecting a moon that looked cracked and wrong. For a split second, I saw a reflection that wasn't mine, a woman in a tattered ranger uniform, her face a hollowed-out mask of gray skin, pointing a bony finger deeper into the thicket. I didn't scream. I couldn't afford to. I followed her silent lead, moving toward the flickering lights of the main station. I realized then that Walker wasn't just gaslighting me. He had replaced the entire reality of this park. The maps were lies. The radio was a leash. And as I reached the station's perimeter, I saw his truck, engine idling, headlights off, pointed straight toward my tower like a loaded gun. He wasn't waiting for morning. He was waiting for me to break, and he was ready to sweep up the pieces. Breaking into the station was disturbingly easy, almost as if the building itself were exhaling, welcoming me into its rot. The air in Walker's office smelled exactly like the mine shaft, metallic, ancient, and bone-chillingly cold. I didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. The risk of being spotted was a death sentence. Instead, I used my flashlight, shielding the beam with my hand as I tore through the filing cabinets, the metal drawers screeching like rusted teeth. I didn't find payroll records, tax forms, or standard fire reports. I found feeding schedules. I found incubation charts with anatomical sketches that made my stomach churn. And then I found the photographs, the physical proof of a decade of horror. Dozens of them were clipped to yellowing manila folders, Polaroid shots of every ranger who had occupied my tower for the last 20 years, arranged in a chronological descent into madness. In the first few photos, they looked just like me, hopeful, maybe a bit tired, with the bright eyes of someone who loved the outdoors. Но по мере того, когда ты прогрессировали, их лица менялись. Their eyes grew wider and vacant. Their skin took on a translucent, waxy quality, until the final photo in every single folder showed something that wasn't human anymore. They didn't disappear, Abby. They were converted. Walker wasn't managing a national park. He was running a high-altitude farm. The Whispering Basin was the nursery, and the fire lookouts were the shepherds, until they grew seasoned enough to become the livestock. My own folder was at the very back of the drawer, the ink still fresh. It was already half full. There were photos of me taken from the tree line that I never noticed. Me sleeping, me crying, me reading that forbidden ledger. There were clinical notes on my psychological breaking point, written in Walker's precise, cold hand, detailing exactly how much fear my heart could take before the melody would take root. The last entry was dated today. It simply said, "Subject 44 is resisting the melody with unexpected vigor. Proceed to manual extraction tonight. The basin is hungry, and she is prime." My breath hitched in my throat as I heard the heavy, unmistakable thud of the station's front door closing. The idling truck outside had gone silent, the vibration in the floorboards disappearing. A shadow fell across the frosted glass of the office door, a silhouette that was far too tall to be a man, with limbs that seemed to have too many joints, and a head that sat at an impossible angle. Walker wasn't just a bad boss or a corrupt ranger anymore. He was the thing the forest had imagined into existence to keep its secrets fed, and he was standing right outside the door. He didn't rush in. He just stood there, his silhouette stretching across the floor, distorted and wrong. "I told you the quiet does things to a woman's mind, Abby," his voice boomed, but it didn't come from his throat. It came from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. "You've seen the files. You've read the history. So you know why you can't leave. The forest doesn't just want your silence. It wants your skin. It wants your memories. It wants to use your voice to call the next one." I didn't answer. I reached into my bag and pulled out the flare gun. I knew I couldn't kill him, not if he was part of the forest itself, but I could light up the dark. I kicked the desk over and dived through the window as he smashed through the office door. The glass shattered, cutting into my arms, but the adrenaline was a numbing tide. I hit the ground running, heading straight back into the trees. I didn't head for the exit. I headed for the Whispering Basin. If Walker wanted a performance review, I was going to give him one he'd never forget. I reached the mine shaft just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, a weak, gray light that offered no comfort. Walker was right behind me, his movements jerky, inhuman, his face a shifting mask of the rangers he had consumed. I stood over the pile of canisters and held the flare gun to the rusted valve of the largest one. "If I'm going into the dirt, Walker," I screamed, "I'm taking the nursery with me." The look on his face wasn't anger. It was pure primal terror. I pulled the trigger. The world didn't just explode, it screamed. A blinding white light swallowed the trees, the mine, and Walker's distorted form. I'm recording this final message from a hospital bed in a town 3 counties away. They found me wandering the highway, my hair burnt, my eyes bloodshot, clutching a charred leather ledger. They say there was a massive forest fire, a natural event. They say Ranger Walker was a hero who died trying to save the park. But sometimes, when the room gets too quiet, I hear it. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from under my hospital bed. And I know the forest doesn't care about fire. It just waits for the next person to listen to the silence. The first thing I remember when I woke up was the smell of bleach. It was so sharp, so clinical, that for a moment I thought I was back in my old office in Seattle, dreaming of forests and monsters. But then I tried to move my arm, and the IV line tugged at my skin. I was in a hospital bed in a small town 3 counties away from Black Elk Park. The walls were a pale, neutral beige, and the window looked out onto a parking lot, not a tree line. I should have felt safe. I should have felt like the nightmare was over. But the silence in that hospital room wasn't the peaceful quiet of recovery. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a hunter, waiting for its prey to stop twitching. 2 detectives came to see me on the second day. They were kind, in that practiced, detached way that law enforcement officers are when they think they're talking to a crazy person. They told me there had been a massive forest fire, a natural event triggered by a dry lightning strike, according to the official report. They told me that nearly 4,000 acres of Black Elk Park had been reduced to ash, including the station and my tower. And then they told me about Ranger Walker. They called him a hero. They said he died trying to reach my tower to save me from the encroaching flames. They found his truck near the station, but they never found his body. The heat was intense enough to vaporize bone, one of them said, scribbling something in his notebook. I sat there clutching the thin hospital blanket, and I didn't say a word about the black canisters. I didn't tell them about the ledger or the photos of the converted Rangers. I knew that if I spoke the truth, the psych evaluation Walker had threatened me with would become a permanent reality in a state institution. I just nodded and let them believe I was a victim of trauma and smoke inhalation. But every time they turned their backs, I looked at my hands. My palms were still stained with the soot of that flare gun, and beneath the skin, I could swear I felt a faint, rhythmic pulsing, a beat that didn't belong to my own heart. The fire had taken the trees, but it hadn't taken the melody. It was still there, humming in the back of my skull, waiting for a moment of weakness to grow back into a song. A week later, I was released. I didn't go back to Seattle. I couldn't face the fluorescent lights in the cubicles again, not after seeing what true darkness looked like. I moved to a small coastal town where the only trees were stunted, salt-sprayed bushes that didn't look like they could hide anything larger than a seagull. I spent my days staring at the ocean, trying to drown out the memory of the whispering basin. But you can't outrun a secret that's buried in the dirt of your own mind. I started seeing the official news reports on my laptop. The Forest Service released a beautiful tribute video to Ranger Walker, featuring clips of him looking noble in his uniform, talking about conservation and the rhythm of nature. They were erasing the horror, polishing the edges of the nightmare until it looked like a tragic accident. They even mentioned a minor equipment malfunction at the station as the cause of the fire, completely ignoring the fact that the entire building had been a laboratory for something inhuman. Every time I saw his face on the screen, I felt a physical jolt of electricity. I knew he wasn't dead. You don't kill a gatekeeper with a flare and some dry brush. You only make them change their shape. I began to receive letters, plain white envelopes with no return address. Inside, there was never any writing, just a single pressed needle from a Douglas fir tree, fresh, green, smelling of ozone and wet copper. It was a reminder, a performance review that never ended. I realized that the forest doesn't care about boundaries or park lines. It's a network, an ancient web that stretches under every road and every house in this country. Walker wasn't just a man, he was a symptom of a much larger infection. I started looking at the news differently. I noticed the small headlines on page 10, hiker vanishes in Colorado, missing family in the Appalachians, strange lights reported over Northern California. They were all the same patterns, the same official denials, the same hero narratives for the people who are likely the architects of the disappearances. I wasn't a survivor, I was just a witness who had been allowed to live so that I could watch the world get eaten one sector at a time. I'm recording this final entry from a motel room on the edge of the highway. I don't stay in one place for more than 3 days anymore. My hair is shorter now, dyed a color that doesn't match my ID, and I've learned how to sleep with one eye open and a flare gun under my pillow. People ask me why I'm so afraid of the woods. They tell me that nature is a place of healing, a place to find yourself. And I tell them they're right. Nature is a place where you find yourself, but only if you're lucky. If you're not, something else finds you first. Something that has been waiting since the glaciers retreated to have a conversation with your soul. If you're listening to this and you're thinking about taking that job in the Forest Service, or if you're planning that deep woods camping trip to get away from it all, pay attention. Don't look for the places that aren't on the map. If you find a trail that feels too straight or a clearing where the birds don't sing, turn around. Don't be curious. Don't be a hero. And for the love of God, if you meet a ranger who seems a little too calm, a little too rhythmic in his speech, don't ask him about the history of the park. Just get back in your car and drive until you see the glow of a city. Because the truth is, the rhythm Walker talked about, it's real. It's a vibration that sits just below the frequency of human hearing. It's the sound of the earth breathing, and it's hungry for new voices. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when the motel walls feel thin, I hear a tapping. It's not at the door, it's not at the window. It's coming from the floorboards, right beneath my bed. 3 distinct rhythmic knocks. Tap, tap, tap. He's still conducting the performance review, Abby. He's just waiting for the next movement in the symphony. My name is Abby, and this was my last day in Black Elk Park. But I think, in a way, I'm still there. I think a part of me never left that tower. And if you go there on a foggy night, if you listen closely to the wind in the pines, you might just hear me whistling back. Don't hum along. Please, whatever you do, don't hum along.